Ben Shute here with a few thoughts today on Dvorak's Violin Concerto. For me, this is really one of the most underrated works in the literature, and I would personally, unreservedly place it in the very top tier of romantic violin concertos. It's less splendid than something like Tchaikovsky, a bit less Olympian than Beethoven or Brahms, and less volcanic than Sibelius. But there's this incredible sylvan beauty to it almost, a really compelling inner narrative and a richness of invention in the way everything is realized, that for me put it in the uppermost tier of romantic concertos. Anecdotally, this piece was very special to me growing up. As a teenager, it really seemed to uniquely capture my experience growing up in the beautiful wooded Brandywine River Valley of northern Delaware, southern Pennsylvania, and the sense of mystery and wonder and adventure in discovering the seemingly endless miles of rolling woodlands and little roads as the river valley opened northward. So I think the nature muse was very important to Dvorak, and actually to others of his Czech compatriots as well. I think, Smetana and the Moldau. So I think, and of course the New World Symphony, great example of the inspiration of the American landscape on Dvorak. I think if we can tap into that will bring us close to the heart of this concerto, and I hope in a very rewarding way. The difficulty with the piece, though, is that it's less flattering to the violin than most other violin concertos. A lot sits right in this nasty octave or so in the D and A string area. I mean, even just the way the concerto opens. Exactly that octave. I mean, when you compare that to most other violin concertos, whether it's something like Brahms, start down low, and before it takes you right up to octaves in the upper register, or Beethoven, which in a different way traverses that same spectrum even more actually. So you start down here, end up here, or Mendelssohn, which just starts high and stays high. Or Tchaikovsky. But all of them have in common an exploration of the outer registers of the violin, whereas Dvorak is right in that nasty register, and a lot of the concerto's most expressive moments take place there. So I think the danger for us is that we're tempted to push the sound a bit, trying to get a little bit more sound to get up and over the orchestra or piano that we're playing with. I think we don't need to do that. I think it's better if we really just focus on getting a warm and soulful sound. I think that will project better ultimately, but it will, of course, sound better too. And a trick that a former teacher of mine, Masako Ushioda, told me is that when you're playing in a dress rehearsal, say with an orchestra, if you're feeling like you have to push the instrument when the dress rehearsal comes, just play quieter. Make the orchestra balance to that and find their voice within the slightly lower dynamic level, and then in the concert, you can feel free to open up a bit, and you won't feel like you have to push the instrument. So that's something you can keep in mind too. There are rehearsal techniques like that can help you feel at home in areas of the violin that aren't necessarily the most hospitable, let's say. Second related sound consideration is that when the Dvorak concerto does go up higher on the E string, very often it's in the context of more dramatic and intense passage work, which, when you think about how Brahms and Beethoven often use the upper register of the violin, oftentimes it's these kind of soaring, spacious lines that let the violin sing and breathe a bit more. It's a bit different than how Dvorak sometimes do it, whereas when the passage work is quite intense, and often in Dvorak the difficulty is that it's not always bolstered by, say, double stops with the A string that can mellow and broaden the sound a bit. So it's sometimes tricky in the Dvorak to find the really nice sound that we're looking for. And I think there are a few things that we can keep in mind to help. One is not to use too much bow on the E string. The temptation is sometimes to use more bow to get more sound, but if we economize and really think about getting into the string with an economical bow stroke, that can help to focus the sound more. The other thing is, this is going to vary instrument to instrument, but not bowing too close to the bridge. But if we go a little further out, the sound is warmer. Another thing is to think about where we can articulate the sound. And usually when we think of articulation, we think of how we begin notes. We think of maybe hitting the beginning of a note. But articulation, of course, is equally how we end. And I'm thinking particularly of the endings of notes here. Where can we, especially when he writes a dot, but even sometimes when you just come to the end of a gesture or the end of a slur, where can we release the sound? And notice I'm not doing the dot by hitting or cutting. You want to let it sing, and then at the end, just kind of have a gracious ending, so that we let the sound go up and away. And I think that will help to get a little bit more of the warmth of sound that we're looking for. Musically, then, one of the biggest challenges for the Dvorak Concerto, I think, is just to make it as gestural as it needs to be. It's very gestural music, but it can sometimes on the page look a little bit squarer than some of the other violin concertos. There are a lot of passages that just look like straight quarters or eighth notes, and we have to delve a little bit beneath the surface to try to find those expression markings. For example, right when the violin comes in, we have the dom, ya da da dim. It's very easy to just treat each note equally and same vibrato or the same bow usage on each one. But if we can really feel right that 4/3 dissonance and release, going toward the harmony change there on the downbeat, and the net result will be a little bit more pull there probably. Then it repeats. Then it repeats up an octave. And again. And again. And then it goes up. And I like to stretch that so I can actually finger that top note rather than just do a harmonic. A harmonic is often done, but especially since the next time we have to finger that top note for, put pressure on. I like to do the same thing with that E, and if your hand can permit that, you can just kind of practice what that space feels like and get used to it that way. It's not overwhelmingly risky, I think. Anyway, so that's just to say we want to be really attentive to gestural and the gestural content throughout the concerto. Really look at where the pulls and the counterpoint are, where the passing tones are, where there's a spicy harmony, and we also want to be careful that we keep gestural coherence within passage work, where sometimes it's hard to do that. One good example, you have. It's just a nasty, not a convenient passage for the violin. There are all sorts of different fingerings. The one I like that I feel gives oftentimes there's people want to insert a harmonic for the last one. For me, that is a little bit anticlimactic. What I like to do from third position down to second, down to straight across to the E string. Then I just shift up to the E string, then I go back down to the E string. Now I shift here and I do an open E with a second finger on the A and cross over to D and G to the A and D strings. 2 on the A, open E, and then first finger on the F, third finger on the D, and from there I stretch a 10th. That way we can have each of those notes being solid notes rather than harmonic, and it also minimizes some of the break that we sometimes have to take to leap around with other fingerings. So that's what I like. I found it works well. Okay, so gestural coherence and gestural distinctness. And I think that really applies throughout the concerto. For what it's worth to consider some of the form that we'll encounter. The first movement, actually the beginning of the first movement, the way the beginning of the first movement is structured, reminds me a bit of another A minor concerto, the great Brahms double concerto, where you have a short statement in the orchestra, soloist statement, and then the proper orchestral introduction begins. Interestingly, though, the Dvorak with that orchestral post-soloist introduction that then unfolds. It's not really the exposition of a classical, or the orchestral exposition of a classical form. It introduces some themes that we'll hear, but then those get expanded tremendously by the soloist and go off in new areas. So we really lose that tight coherence between the orchestral introduction and the rest of the movement as it unfolds, the way we would have in a true classical concerto structure. So it feels much more rhapsodic, and the amazing thing is that it works so well. I mean, I never feel like the musical coherence is in any jeopardy. It just feels so organic and natural. But what it does feel to me, it does feel as though that first movement is more of an overture to the rest of the concerto than fulfilling what the typical first movement of a concerto is. Usually it's the big sonata-form movement that is a lot of the meat and potatoes of the concerto. And to the Dvorak, I feel like it's kind of opening us up in like an overture toward the second movement, which for me is really the heart and soul of the piece. It's for me, it's one of the most sublime things in the literature, and I think it's as good as anything Dvorak ever wrote. I love that second movement. I do think, though, that a lot of the musical issues that we encounter in the second one, and really the whole concerto for that matter, they're wonderful and rich, but in many cases fairly straightforward. So I think there's just one last point that I'd like to touch on, and that's in the third movement. So the theme of the movement can often sound a little bit square. And if we're not careful, we can not even really be sure what key signature what time signature we're in. It sounds like 3/4, bum bim bum 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 bum, when actually it's 3/8, bum bim bum 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 bum. And how can we make that distinction? Should we make a distinction? Does it matter? I think, now this may be the early music person in me, but I think the distinction comes from the fact that the 3 beats of a triple meter bar, for me, have quite different functions. In a case like this, I would probably think of the downbeat as having a little bit more gravity. I mean, if you imagine downbeat, a little bit of rebound, and then the third beat having a little bit more propulsion, driving us into the next downbeat. So I mean, if I were to exaggerate that, not only with weights but timing, maybe. Now, of course, that's quite exaggerated. But when you have that paradigm inside you, that actually gives a very, very different feel to the theme, depending on whether you're thinking of it in 3/4 or 3/8. Because if you're thinking of it in 3/4, so you have the release and then the propulsion, release, propulsion. But if you're thinking of it in 3/8, the way Dvorak wrote it, yes, there's the hemiola effect, but a lot of Dvorak's music and a lot of the Czech folk idiom has a lot of, for example, similar thing. It sounds like, but it's really, and I do feel like we're meant to feel that it's not supposed to just be a hemiola, because a hemiola is usually an isolated thing in context, and we feel the metrical tension because we're used to feeling something in, say, 3/4, and then suddenly we feel a 3/2 bar, or we're used to feeling something in 3/8, and then we feel 3/4. But if our only context is, you know, the 3/8 meter, but everything feels like it's in 3/4, then we lose that tension. And I do feel like we're supposed to feel the tension. So if the different beats of the bar indeed do work out so differently, then I played what it would be like in 3/4. But in 3/8, it would be more like, because now the second note falls on 1, 2, 3, so it's going to have a little bit more of that forward propulsion, and I play it with a little bit more sparkle. And I would probably also give it a little bit more feeling of direction into the downbeat. Obviously, I don't accent the downbeat. We do not want to do that. But we can just feel that little bit of electricity drawing from the third beat through the tie downbeat into that next accent. So that little bit of bum bing bum 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 bum, a little bit of sparkle on the second note of each group of 3, I think will help it to feel more like 3/8 rather than 3/4. Then as far as the overall shape of the phrase, if we just go, it can feel a little matter of fact. I like to think of it in terms of, that's one gesture, and then, so that we have bum ding dun dun ding dum, and then that last idea repeats again, dun 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 dun, and takes us further. And I think if we think of it that way, it can make it a little bit more rhetorical. It can make it a little bit more, we feel more of the inner necessity that might have made Dvorak write it that way. Because of course, you know, as we're playing a concerto, we always want to give the sense, or as we're playing anything, we always want to give the sense that we are bringing out what made the composer write those notes, those gestures, as if we were coming up with it on the spot, as if the music has to be this way just because it does. And if it ever feels like just matter of fact, well, I'm playing it this way because that's what is printed on the page, I think we've really lost the spirit of the music. So I think will help us to have a little bit more of the inner urgency of that phrase. And then that wonderful forte piano. Yeah, we want to give it a little zing. Don't worry about it to the point if you find yourself forcing the sound or getting not quite the sound you want. Remember that the orchestra has that under you, and they don't have the turn that they have to worry about. So the turn necessarily limits quite how much of effect of the forte piano you can get. So you can also remember that you do some, but the orchestra can also contribute quite a lot to that. So you don't need to overdo it to the point that you're not getting the sound that you want. Okay, I think that's about what we have time for today. But I hope these are some helpful things to keep in mind, and as always, happy practicing.